So next we're going to take a look at the SQL queries for strings. And you're going to use this probably just as often as you would some of the math. And it doesn't seem like it, but things like manipulating names, let's say street names, product names. So that's what we're going to show right here, is just what kind of common commands are available from the SQL language that we can use. So using our employees table again, we're going to take a look at the login ID this time. And you'll notice that the logins have a domain, adventure-works, a slash, and then the actual login at the end of it, at the tail end of that thing. So we can do a few things with this in our result set. We can force all of these strings to be uppercase. Well, I can't type. So all the results are all uppercase, and obviously the opposite's available too if you just do lower. In fact, we can do it this way. We can also trim these fields. This field doesn't have any spaces, so I can't use the data field for that, but without changing the data. But what I can do is use the trim command on something that I add spaces to anyway. So put a couple spaces in here. Let's say we have a name like Gregory, and put 3 spaces on the end. So what trim does is it goes to both sides, the left and the right, and it gets rid of those spaces. If we didn't do that, the field would just come back that way. It would be the single quotes, which says this is a string. And I know these look alike, but you can do something like this if you want to actually look at it. Paste Gregory. And you'll notice that the second one pasted with the spaces included. In addition to that, we can start from the left or the right side of a string field, and we'll pick on the login ID. And we can grab certain characters, or a number of characters. For example, from the left, I can grab 6 characters, let's say. And it grabs just the first 6 characters starting from the left side. And it basically starting from 0 basically, and it goes in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And of course you have the exact opposite, which is the right. And we can go in the right. We'll do that one 3. And it's the exact opposite, pulls it from the right side, comes 3 characters in, and returns that value. Now I know this is if you're new to a lot of these queries, this looks like, well, where am I going to use this, right? So we're going to go through a quick explanation here. It might get a little complicated, but we're going to use another command called the CHARINDEX or CharacterIndex. And what this is it finds characters inside the string. So I'm going to look for this slash. The slash you see here, I'm going to look for that slash in the login ID. I'm going to start from the very beginning, which is 0. And we just run this. So with these commands, what I'm looking at is the ability for me to find a string inside that field and bring back that string, because I now have a location for a character. That's what the character index does. It just brings back the number showing me where that string is. And we could change this too. We could make this something more complicated than just a single character. We could do something like the word adventure, which is obviously in the beginning. We run this, and since it's the first character is where it starts, the index of the adventure word is number 1. Or you can change it to something like works, and the index is the 11th character in. So let's do something more complicated using these statements to manipulate strings. We're going to still use the login, but what I want to do is, because I'm an administrator and I have this list of domain and logins, I want to separate the domain from the login. So I have one field that's a login and the other field is my domain. And I want it to be portable so I can run it on another table, maybe another piece of software's database that happens to save it in the same format. So what I'm going to do first is I need to find that slash, which is that char index. I'm going to put slash login ID, the field we're looking at, and we're going to start with the beginning, which is our 0. And we already know it's at 16. So for the next one, I can say, well, if I want to bring that value back, the domain value back, I could start from the left, just like we did before. And I know how many characters to go in now because it's 16. So if I execute that, I've got my domain plus my slash. Let's name this domain, and we'll name this just index. So what I can do to get rid of that slash, because remember it's the location, so it's the 16th character, so that means I actually only need 15, not 16. So if we're starting from the left side and we subtract 1, we go down to 15, then that'll get rid of that slash and gives me AdventureWorks, right? So what if we get the other side now? We need the login. We're starting from the right side, same field, the login ID, except 15 is not right. So how do we get the last part of the string using the character index? Because we know what the slash is. What we can use is something called the length, E-L-E-N. We haven't looked at this one yet. But the length will tell you the length of the string. In fact, let's call this as so now what we have is we have the index of the slash, we have the full length of the string, so we can use those two values to figure out how to pull the domain out. So starting from the right, if we're using right, we need to subtract the total minus the index to get us the beginning point of the domain. So the total, or the full length, is the LEN, login ID. So I'm going to stick it in here as the second parameter. And I'm going to subtract the actual index, which is this slash index. And I'm going to stick it in here, all inside the parentheses. Keep in mind that I'm still inside the parentheses for the right command. Now, and now we have the login on the far right, and we have the domain separated into two separate fields, even though we use the same login string to pull that information back. So I know this might seem a little bit confusing, But if you want to rewind and kind of walk through this, it actually does make a lot of sense, and it's very useful to be able to pull back strings. In addition, that was more of an example of some of the functions that SQL gives you. Some of the math that we used before, for example, adding, we can concatenate strings onto the end or the beginning of certain data types. So in this case, I'm adding the string ultra with a space to the login ID and then space test to the end of it. Now, since the login ID is an nvarchar, it doesn't have any problem with casting or converting that login ID to a string and allowing me to insert that string. Now, if I tried to do something similar to, let's say, the date field, or the date data type, let's say I try to add big, it's going to give me a conversion error because it doesn't understand what to do with the date data type, and then you're trying to add a string to that. So you have to be careful with what strings you're working with, and we'll look at casting and converting different data types, but some, like the date, for example, can be casted as a string itself, and that way you can work with it as a string. So I can cast my higher date as a varchar. Let's just make it a 20, something like that. So this makes the higher date into a string, and then I'm adding the word big before it. That looks kind of weird, but that's basically what it did. Is it grabbed the date, converted it to a string that's readable, and added that my string to the higher date field. The reverse of this also works. If you have the correct format, you can take the date as a string and you can cast it as a date data type. And in some cases, like with SSIS, you might have to do that in order to complete an insert. So last thing to look at regarding strings is another command called substring. Substring is another method like what we did with the right and the left, where you can take a string, choose a starting point and an ending point, and it'll return that value for you. So let's make this 12. So the way to read this would be the substring. You're using the login ID again. You're starting at 0 and you're returning 12 characters in. So it started from the left and it counted 12 characters in, and it's giving me that information. Now, just like we did before, we can go in here and say, well, I know the number is 15 for the domain. And I can come in here and say, go 15 characters in from the beginning, and it'll give me that domain field. But again, I know what that number is. So using the character index, I can replace this with my CHARINDEX statement. And this replaces that number. So now I can apply this to another field where the domain doesn't happen to be 15 characters long. If I run that, so now I'm pulling the AdventureWorks domain back. Then we can do the same thing again with the substring. But in this case, we have to reverse it. And we need the same thing we had before. We need the full length, and we need to subtract the domain. So we already have the number for the domain. So we know where we're going to start. We're going to start here. So we can copy this character index, and we're going to start. Character index is 15 characters. or I'm sorry, 16 characters in, and then we need to know how far to go. Well, we just want to go to the end, so we can just specify I want to use the full length of the entire string as my ending location, ending number. So now we have our domain, but we got a little sticking point here. We've got a slash in there. We need to get rid of that slash. So obviously we're going using our character index right here in the middle. So going back to the math that we were using before, that character index pulls back a number. So, and I know this, so I can subtract or I can add a number to that. So for me to get rid of the slash, I need to add or do a +1. And now I have a clean domain and I have a clean login. And this is just using the substring command instead of the right and left that we used before. Please leave your comments. Don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for watching.